June 6, 1944. 06:28 hours. English Channel off Vierville-sur-Mer, Normandy. Spray slaps the bows like handfuls of broken glass. The little boat bucks, climbs, and shudders again as the coxswain feathers the throttle, a Gray Marine 225 humming under the deck boards, the smell of hot oil and salt stitched into every plank. 30 men of A Company, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division, sway in silence behind the steel ramp, helmets knocking the slatted sides, rifles held upright to keep them dry. Someone vomits and mutters an apology. Over the coxswain's shoulder, a red signal flare blooms and dies in the mist, and the coastline resolves into concrete teeth and dark gun ports, a jagged mouth waiting to bite. "Stand by!" the coxswain yells, voice snagging on the wind. He's motor machinist's mate, second class Jack Boudreau, a New Orleans boy who grew up where water's always close, bayous, canals, the Great Brown River. He taps the rudder bar with his heel, checking the swing. To port, another LCVP slews as a shell erupts just beyond its bow, draping it in a brief, terrible curtain of water. To starboard, a column of landing craft dances in and out of the smoke like a jittery newsreel. Behind them, in gray ranks, assault transports and battleships shoulder the horizon, still hammering the bluffs, with high, flat arcs of steel. But close in, the big guns feel like a rumor. What is real are the ripples, the yawing chop, the rattle of the boat's two aft gun mounts, and the way the tide keeps trying to take them sideways and away from the gap they need to find. He noses them toward a darker stripe where the surf breaks differently, shallow water, a sandbar edge. The ramp clanks as a corporal uses its top to steady himself. "How far?" someone asks. No one answers. Boudreau glances at the depth board, 2 feet, then less. He eases the throttle down. The hull's flat run skims and then bites. The plywood sides creak. The spoon bow kisses sand and settles. The whirl compresses to the rivets in the ramp and the rope cleat near his left hand. "Drop the ramp!" he shouts. The cable whines. The ramp crashes forward and the sea leaps in like a thief. For a split second, the whole craft becomes a doorway. Gray sky, gray water, a beach choked with hedgehogs and Belgian gates, tracers stitched low and flat. Then the soldiers move, wordless and practiced. Boots splash into knee-deep chill. A sergeant turns, shoves a private toward a tangle of steel, and the line funnels into the gap like grain pouring from a sack. Machine gun rounds swat the face of the water. Geysers rise behind men who have already vanished into the haze. The boat exhales its burden in seconds. Boudreau watches them go with a tight jaw he doesn't feel. The ramp is slick under the wash. A helmet floats past, then a mess kit. He knows this choreography by muscle memory. Ramp down, men off, engine reverse, rudder hard over, ramp up, back out, turn in the slot, another run. Around him, the small boats are everywhere. Dozens, scores, hundreds, each one a knuckled, stubborn gesture against the surf and the fire. He remembers the first time he put his hand on the tiller of one of these and felt how it slid over the skin of shallow water like a heron's foot. He remembers the accent of the foreman who swore at him the day he stalled one in training, half Irish Channel. A burst rakes the stern. The port gunner fires back, bright casing spitting into the bilge. "Hold it!" Boudreau yells to no one, to the boat itself, to the little rectangle of deck and ribs he trusts like a friend. He throttles in reverse, the prop biting sand, churning chocolate water. The bow peels free with a lurch. The ramp comes up dripping and leaves a nah sound in the winch as if it too is straining. He swings the tiller, catches a trough, and the LCVP slides backward like a crab, then pivots clean. They race seaward at 12 knots, light now and rattling. As spray needles his face, Boudreau has the strange thought that if you strip the paint and numbers and weapons, this boat would look at home in the places he grew up, in the bayou cuts lined with cypress knees, where the water is brown and quiet, where men learn to build boats that float in inches and shrug off snags. He can hear, just for a blink, the sounds of New Orleans. A planer's whine, a mallet-thudding oakum, laughter from a break table. The memory arrives uninvited and leaves just as quickly, replaced by smoke and the next vector in. On the transport's lee, they fall into line to load another chalk. "Keep it tight, Boudreaux," a petty officer barks from the deck, palm down, chopping the air. The coxswain nods and edges alongside, letting the swell do half the work. Soldiers clamber down the scramble nets, faces pale and focused. One pauses, looks straight at him and blurts, "Thank you, skipper." Boudreaux wants to say he's not the skipper, not really. The boat is, but he only nods. "Where's this one going?" he asks as the last man drops in. "Easy red," the petty officer says, as if any square foot of that beach deserves the word. "Watch the cross tide." "Aye." He kicks off, swings the bow toward shore, and the gray marine climbs into a confident growl. The boat, light and quick, leans into the work. She isn't pretty, no sheer, no flare, just a plywood box with a steel grin, but she's the right kind of ugly. Everything about her is a sentence finished with a period. Flat bottom to ride over shoals. Skegs to keep her honest. A ramp that eats a shoreline and turns it into a door. "Check the bilge!" he calls. The pump chatters, water drops from the ramp's hinges and tap, tap, taps on the deck. The gunner scans for wakes, the telltale shadows of tell mines, and the bowman braces his knees, rope in hand, the surf line widening like a road they must cross before the light changes. Another flare. Another punctuation of impact down the line. The channel wears the metallic smell of blood now, sharp and sweet and wrong.
2 minutes!
2 minutes! Boudreaux shouts, and the words vanish in the wind. He remembers a different wind, heavy with summer rain, pushing across Lake Pontchartrain. He remembers the first night drill when he learned how these boats slide sideways under a cross breeze, how to anticipate with rudder and throttle so the bow puts itself where the math says it can't. The instructors barked at him in that tight-lipped shipyard way, proud of the boats like they were their own children, which in a sense they were. 1 minute. The surf grows brash and loud. The bow lifts, slaps, closer and closer. Ahead, a structure like a giant child's toy, angled iron welded into a hedgehog, leans in the tide, and he aims for a gap between it and a wall of stakes. The boat obliges, all lines straight, all forces summed. It is the simplest thing and the hardest. Arrive with just enough push to plant, but not so much you break yourself. Ramp! Again the rope sings. Again the rectangle opens. Again men step into the gray and become shadows climbing a beach no one will ever forget. Boudreaux holds them steady until the last pack disappears, then throws her astern. The hull shivers, then retreats like a breath taken back. Everything is motion and math and nerve. Yet within it, something steady. A design that makes sense in the hands. You feel it in your calves, in the wheel, in the way the boat takes a wave. You feel, too, the mind that built it. Someone who knew shallow water as a kind of language, who could listen to what tide and timber said and answer with a boat that did not argue but translated. On the third run, a shell falls so close the concussion shoves the air out of his chest. He blinks and sees his hands on the tiller, steady, the knuckles pale. The gray marine coughs once, then clears its throat and carries on. He glances at the stencil near the bow, letters obscured by grit and brine. LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel. A name that tells you everything and nothing. There is a moment, heading back out, where the swells lift him above the smoke and he can see the procession end to end. Strings of small boats crawling from mother ships to the living shore and back again, a loom weaving one color into another. The big guns speak in the distance. The German positions spit and snap. Between those giant arguments, the little boats keep their own counsel and do the arithmetic that wins or loses minutes. You can't storm Europe from a pier. You have to make your own. Boudreaux spits over the side, wipes his mouth, and squints at the channel. He feels the boat's eagerness. She wants another run. He gives it to her. And if, for a heartbeat, he thinks of New Orleans, the clatter of a factory floor along the industrial canal, The sight of a foreman chalking numbers on a fresh-cut plank, the oddball owner who swore like a tugboat and told designers to throw away their slide rules and go run the boat in real water. That thought rides with him into the next wave and does not slow him down. "Hold on," he calls, voice flat with certainty. The LCVP answers like a bayou skiff that found its war, and the bow rises again toward the beach that will need 1,000 more rides before the day is done. August 3rd, 1939, Lake Pontchartrain, New Orleans. Dawn lays a pewter sheen across the lake as a squat wooden workboat noses out from the industrial canal. Andrew Jackson Higgins stands in the bow, tie loose, hat tilted back, one palm on the coaming like he owns the water, because in his head, he does. He is 53, barrel-chested, impatient, a lumberman turned boat builder who swears at problems until they get out of his way. Behind him, carpenters in sweat-dark shirts lounge on deck boxes. A gray marine engine mutters underfoot. Ahead, a sand spit rises thin as a grin. "Take her in," Higgins snaps. The coxswain bumps the throttle. The boat, Higgins' pride, the Eureka, slides over 10 inches of water as if it were grease. The spoonbow kisses the sand and stops. A deckhand kicks over a crate and 4 men drag a hogshead barrel to the edge. Higgins nods. They shove. The barrel rolls off, thumps onto the spit, and sits there like a claim. "Back her out." The coxswain drops astern. The prop, protected in a tunnel, chews a chocolate froth and the flat bottom peels free. The boat slides backward, turns in its own width, and stands off, cocky as a heron. Higgins watches the barrel for a beat, then turns to the visitors in dark suits, the Marine Corps Equipment Board men from Quantico. They've come to see a rumor, a shallow draft craft that can run up on a beach, dump cargo, and get away without killing its own propeller. One of them, a captain with a schoolmaster's frown, takes notes like he's grading a paper. The other squints into the sun and finally smiles. "Mr. Higgins," he says, "do it again." They do it again, barrel after barrel, bundle after bundle, until the doubters stop doubting and the note-taking slows. On their train north, the Marines argue about the details, framing, planking, the tunnel's curve, but not about what they saw. In their reports, they use words Higgins likes: practical, robust, self-retracting. The Eureka becomes a name whispered in hallways at Quantico and at the Bureau of Construction and Repair in Washington, though not always with love. To some Navy designers, the man in New Orleans is a pugnacious outsider who thinks water is a better drafting table than vellum. November 12, 1939, Quantico, Virginia. The Potomac is brittle with cold. The Test Cove wears a skim of ice at the edges. A Eureka slaps in, painted fresh for the occasion. A colonel stomps his boots and mutters, "If it runs here, it'll run anywhere." A mule blinks on the shore, harness jingling. Higgins didn't bring the mule, that was the Marines, but he sees the theater in the choice and says nothing. They load the mule, nose the boat up, and the animal clops down onto the pebbles, unbothered by history. The Eureka passes its exams. The Marines, thinking about island shores that do not offer piers, order a small lot. The Navy hedges, buys from other yards, and tries to bend Higgins to their line's plans. He bends less than they'd like. "Build it, then break it," he says, "and build it better." He isn't anti-engineer. He's anti-theory. His designers, good ones, draw what the water teaches them. The spoonbow to lift and slide. The protected prop tunnel to keep weeds and sand from chewing metal. The hard Chinese to keep the boat honest and flat when it must run in inches. November 1937. Amoy Harbor, China. Long before the Quantico Mule, a Marine lieutenant named Victor H. Brute. Krulak crouches behind a seawall and watches Japanese Daihatsu landing barges do something American boats cannot. The barges run ashore, a steel bow opens on hinges, and soldiers spill out at a trot, dry from the knees down. The ramp, simple, brutal, obvious, sears itself into Krulak's memory. He snaps photos. When he brings those images home, senior Marines see not just a gadget, but a doctrine. No more climbing over gunnels under fire. No more bottlenecks at the bow. Spring 1941. New Orleans, Louisiana. Higgins slaps Krulak's photographs on a drafting table and grunts. "Hell, we can cut a hole," he says, half to himself. His chief draftsman, Andrew Higgins Jr., turning WW2 and foreman Arthur Bergeron trade rye looks. Cutting out the bow means rethinking the frames, the shear, the way forces move when the boat hits a beach. They argue, sketch, and then stop arguing and go to the shop floor, where the answers will either float or sink. Saws sing. A Eureka's forward planking comes off in wide, clean sheets. Carpenter's sister frames beef up the king plank and lay in channels for a steel door that will become the grin of a war the world hasn't yet declared. The first tries look right and act wrong. The door binds, the winch balks, the bow pounds and chop. Higgins prowls the aisles, tie flapping, and curses in a rolling patter the men come to regard as weather. "Fix the damn hinge. No, don't make it pretty. Make it true." He drags the boat back to the lake. They run her into sand, drop the new ramp, and prove to themselves that a beach can be turned into a doorway. The Marines christen the notion LCPR, Landing Craft Personnel, ramp, for the early narrow beam versions. But the better idea is already in the wood. Widen the boat, give it more shoulder, let it carry a squad and then some, or a jeep and a stack of ammo if asked. By late 1941, the LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, exists in more than theory. It has a steel ramp operated by a simple cable winch, a flat bottom that will skip across tide flats, skegs to keep it tracking true, and a soul born of cypress swamps where shallow water swallows the cocky. The Gray Marine 225 horse engine is not elegant, but it is reliable. The hull is marine plywood over stout frames, fir and oak where it counts, because time is money and plywood is honest. December 7th, 1941. New Orleans. Radio in the shop. A drill press grinds to a stop as voices cluster around a Philco set. Pearl Harbor. Battleships burning bow to stern. The room goes quiet in that way factories do, absorbing shock like a bulkhead. Higgins says nothing for a long beat. Then he jabs a finger at a foreman. "We build for the water we know," he says. "And for the water, they'll have to cross." He tells the personnel office to hire anyone who can do the job. Women, black workers, anyone. In a city that likes its rules unwritten, this is a written one in the Higgins plants. The only color that matters is the paint on the hull. By spring 1942, Higgins Industries is less a company than a city. The City Park plant saws and planes around the clock. The industrial canal yard hums like a beehive. The lake plant swallows lumber by the train car. A new facility at Michoud, converted farmland east of town, sprawls into the marsh. Whistles blow in 3 shifts. Cafeterias serve coffee to people whose hands never quite lose the smell of resin and varnish. On catwalks above assembly lines, supervisors chalk numbers on bulkheads, boats tallied like loaves of bread. A teenage riveter learns to buck steel on the ramps. A grandmother from Treem fits frames with a mallet's sure conversation. A black welder named Joseph Harris teaches a white apprentice how to read a bead. Integrated crews form because the work demands it and because the man at the top will not hear an argument. Higgins walks the floor with 2 speeds, fast and faster. He sticks a hand into a bilge to feel for sawdust and swats a supervisor with his hat for signing a line card when a hinge throws sparks. He is not kind. He is not fair by a company man's definition. But he is effective, and the boats coming out the doors carry a language of their own. Simple sentences written in wood and steel, punctuated by a ramp. June 1942, Washington, D.C. The Procurement War. The Bureau of Ships sends letters full of specifications and doubts. Competing yards, some with better marble lobbies, argue for their own designs. The Marines, about to bet their doctrine on island chains with no piers, push back. The test reports pile up from Guadalcanal in North Africa. Boats that can't back off. Boats that swamp. Boats that break. The LCVP returns from saltwater with scrapes and dents and the functional look of anything that actually works. A memo lands on a desk with the only sentence that matters. Increase orders. November 8, 1942, Vedhala Roads, off Morocco. Torch, pre-dawn. The sea lies dark and nervous. An LCVP squats under a scramble net as soldiers descend in rope-burn jerks, packs heavy and tongues dry. The coxswain, just months out of a Higgins class on Lake Pontchartrain, feels his boat's center of gravity change as men breathe and the deck takes them into itself. He rides a cross swell, drops the ramp on a crescent of sand under French guns, and watches a platoon run into a war that will teach everyone new words. Later, mopping sweat and fuel, he says to a shipmate, "You see how she slid?" The shipmate nods. "Like she was born for it." Back in New Orleans, photos from Torch sit thumbtacked on a bulletin board in the break room. Men and women point at their work on those beaches. Here a ramp, there a combing, and feel a private pride. The production charts go up and to the right. LCVPs leave the line like a metronome that has found the beat of an army. Summer 1943, the Jeep test. Higgins, showman to his bones, stages a demonstration for brass who still carry measuring sticks in their heads. A Jeep idles on an LCVP's deck, exhaust a blue ribbon. Cameras watch. The boat runs ashore, the ramp slaps down, and the Jeep clatters to the beach, gears whining, unbothered by marine math that used to say impossible. Somewhere, a pen signs an order that will turn everything into numbers so large they no longer feel real. Thousands, then tens of thousands. Coxswains learn a new catechism. Feel the cross tide, don't fight the surge, work with it. Plant soft, not hard, never slam the ramp. Keep the prop in its tunnel's sweet spot. Trust the skegs. Count seconds, not yards. They come through New Orleans and then through Solomons and Coronado with calluses that match the LCVP's ribs. They will take those lessons to Sicily, to Tarawa's reef-chewed lagoon, to Anzio's flat water under flat gunfire. The boat will not always be enough. No design can make coral vanish or turn a plane into a miracle. But it will give men a fighting chance in places where chance has been scarce. By the time Jack Boudreau, Bayou Kid turned Navy coxswain, sets his bow toward Omaha Beach, Higgins' boats are no longer experiments. They are the connective tissue of an amphibious nation. Boudreau has never met the man whose signature attitude lives in the way his boat answers the throttle, but he knows the shape of that mind. Impatient with excuses, married to results, at home where fresh water browns into salt. On a humid night in 43, in a small office off the city park floor, Higgins dictates a letter and pauses. The stenographer waits. Outside, a whistle blows shift change and the air fills with footsteps. "Tell them," he says finally, "we can do more." He doesn't mean it as rhetoric. He means quite literally, more boats, more rectangles of deck with ramps like jaws and engines that take a beating. More ways to turn a hostile shoreline into a place a man can step onto with both feet. A year later, off Vierville-sur-Mer, Boudreau drops his ramp into water that tries to punch its way aboard, and men step into the gray with courage that has nothing to do with design and everything to do with why the design matters. In the racket of D-Day, the LCVP's logic, learned on a lake, shaped by a river city, argued into being by a stubborn man, becomes visible as fate. You cannot peer a continent, you have to bring your own. August 7, 1942. Guadalcanal, Iron Bottom Sound. Night leaks out of the jungle as the first gray of morning opens over a patchwork of black water and blacker hills. The sea smells like cordite and hot metal. Cruisers still banging away at the shore, where a strip of coral and mangrove guards a half-built runway the Japanese call Lunga. Boats squat under the davits of transports, engines coughing awake, coxswains rolling shoulders like prize-fighters. In one LCVP, Seaman First Class Gene Harris presses his palm to the throttle housing and feels the familiar thrum of a gray marine 225 through the plywood ribs. The ramp glistens with dew. Marines climb down the nets, Boots finding the boat's slatted sides as if they were rungs on a ladder to another world. "Cast off!" Harris yells. The painter slaps into the water. He kicks her ahead and the bow lifts, the tunnel prop digging a track through the slick. They run across a lagoon the color of bottle glass, steering by a palm stand that looks like a row of bayonets. On the beach, smoke frays into the wind. The boat's flat run kisses the reef, skims, and then thumps sand. "Ramp!" The cable sings. A platoon goes forward at a trot, rifles high. The boat sighs lighter. Harris backs her out, sliding sideways along the reef edge with the tide tugging at his stern like a child. That afternoon, Henderson Field will get its name and its purpose, and the little boats will spend days and nights hauling ammo, water, and men into a place that chews both. They learn the island's math the hard way, watching for coral heads like ambushes, reading the wind shadows behind coconut trunks, backing on the prop tunnel's sweet spot so the rudder still talks. When Japanese bombers come over in singles and bunches, coxswains use mangrove creeks as hiding places and jump wakes like rabbits. The boats survive because they are simple and because the men running them are getting good. September 27th, 1942, west of the Matanikau. A Higgins boat shoulders toward a spit under a sheet of machine gun fire. The coxswain, Coast Guard signalman First Class Douglas Monroe, leans into the wheel with his whole body, the bow zigzagging through smoke. He has volunteered to cover a Marine withdrawal, to put his boat between riflemen and a shoreline that wants to hold them forever. Higgins' boats crowd in around him like a school of stubborn fish. "Hold the line!" someone shouts, though the line is made of plywood and courage. Marines tumble aboard. Others fall short and are dragged in by the straps of their packs. Monroe swings broadside, making a wall where there shouldn't be one. A burst cuts him down moments after the last men clear the sand. He dies with the wheel under his hand and a question on his lips. Did they get off? They did. The Medal of Honor will carry his name, but in the mess decks and coxswain schools, the story will carry a lesson. A ramp is not just a door to a fight, it's a way out of one. November 8th, 1942. Fedhala Roads, Morocco. Operation Torch. Dawn looks different in the Atlantic. Colder, flatter, an iron sheet that doesn't give away where the shoals begin. American soldiers stare over the ramp at French forts painted the color of the cliffs, at surf that whispers one thing and does another. Higgins' boats fumble and then find their rhythm. Coxswains talk each other in with hands and horn blasts, plant soft, drop fast. A squad of engineers uses an LCVP's ramp as a bridge over a soft patch, driving a truck ashore inch by inch while the bowman swears at physics and wins. Later, in an oily lit wardroom, a commander scribbles in a log. Boats adequate and adaptable. Crews improving under fire. It's the kind of sentence that moves numbers in Washington. Washington answers by sending more. New Orleans expands like a story that grew legs. The City Park plant is a forest of sawhorses and jigs. At Michoud, the assembly line stretches long enough to look like a rumor. Crews mix who the city says should not mix and discover that a bead of weld doesn't care about skin. The company newspaper prints photos of bowling leagues that include a riveter with a rosary in her pocket and a welder with a blues harp in his. In an office with maps pinned to every surface, Andrew Higgins stabs a forefinger at the gulf on a blueprint and growls, "Get me more plywood!" Trains show up like gifts. July 10th, 1943, Gela, Sicily, Operation Husky. The night is ink and the surf is a fist. An LCVP rises and falls like a chest that can't get enough air. Rangers crouch behind the ramp, faces lacquered with salt. Shore lights flicker, tracer lines write cursive across the dark. This is where the boat's flat bottom shows both its strength and its flaw. In surf, a flatboat slaps and skitters. In shoal water, it rides over teeth that would tear a deep keel craft's belly out. Coxswains pick their gaps by feel, counting seconds between sets, letting the last wave push them the last yards to plant. A ranger officer, boots sinking, claps a coxswain's shoulder as he steps into Sicily. "Fine seamanship, son." The coxswain nods like a man who knows he still has 3 more trips to make before dawn. September 9th, 1943. Salerno, Operation Avalanche. There's no surprise waiting here, just math. Beaches under paired hills, guns sighted where anyone with a map would sight them, and a line of small boats that must turn open water into a pier by sheer repetition. LCVPs run in, drop, back, turn, repeat, until an order snaps down the radio net like a whip. Pull back! Air attack! Coxswains glance at the sky, a mess of German Ju-88s and 109s chopping the light, and then back at a ramp that refuses to close because a hinge pin bent under somebody else's panic. A deckhand drops a hammer twice. The cable bites. The door comes up. You learn very fast which noises mean ignore it and which ones mean this trip is your last. In meetings days later, someone will say the simple truth out loud. We need more boats because boats are how you buy time. Training shifts to match the war's tempo. At the amphibious training base, Solomons, Maryland, pros teach the catechism with a stick and a stopwatch. Off the davits in 2 minutes. Find your guideboat, keep station, read the tide line, plant soft. At Little Creek, Virginia, flotilla officers learn how to choreograph chaos, wave tables, timing, the dark art of turning a sea lane into a conveyor belt. On the West Coast, Coronado blows sand into the teeth of young coxswains who learn to surf a Higgins boat like a living thing. Down in Fort Pierce, Florida, scouts and raiders rehearse the jobs that have to happen before any ramp can drop. Reconnoiter the beach, cut the wire, mark the lanes, get out unseen. Everywhere, the boat is the constant. The squared bow, the skegs, the tunneled prop that lets you back off a mistake if your hands and head work together. November 20th, 1943. Bayou Island, Tarawa, Operation Galvanic. The lagoon looks like a postcard until it doesn't. The tide is wrong, low when it should be high, and an invisible saw blade of coral lies just under green water. LCVPs grind to a stop 5, 6, 700 yards out. Marines step off into chest-deep fire and stumble forward, packs dragging, rifle muzzles barely clear. Behind them, LVT alligators crawl over the reef, blessing the planners who fought to get them aboard. In an LCVP pinned on the coral, a coxswain taps the throttle and tries to make the boat wiggle free like a stuck crawfish. The skegs search for purchase they won't find. He drops his ramp anyway. Men spill out, use the boat's shadow for one breath of shelter, and go. The coxswain shouts a prayer and a curse in the same breath and keeps his boat's bow toward the island like willpower alone could change a tide. Tarawa is an anatomy lesson in cost. The little boats do what they can and fail where nothing else would succeed either. In Higgins' offices, photos arrive that make foremen fold their arms tight across their chests. The lesson is not that the boat is wrong. The lesson is that there is no one boat that solves every bad idea a reef can have. The fix is doctrine and timing, and more craft of many kinds. Through it all, the production meters turn. More than 20,000 LCVPs flow from New Orleans and from licensed yards in the Midwest, where farmers' daughters learn to buck rivets and lake sailors teach river tricks to men who grew up on wheat and wind. A reporter asks Eisenhower, in a moment of candor after the war, what won it? He will answer the thing men in Greenwater already know. A factory that understood a shoreline and a little boat that turned beaches into doors. April 1944, Slapton Sands, Devon, Exercise Tiger. Darkness and bad radio discipline breed their own enemies. E-boats slide in like sharks. Torpedoes find LSTs in the night. The sea lights with burning fuel and men who never learned to fear English water. In daylight, corrections roll through the amphibious fleet like repentance. More escorts, better nets, tighter comms, radios that do not step on each other. Coxswains stare at the pebbled curve of Slapton and watch a sea that looks like Normandy. Same slope, same stones, same ways to be fooled. The simulations are not theater. They are a narrowing. Each mistake shaved now as one less corpse later. By early June, the channel thickens with ships, and the LCVP nestle along their mothers like chicks under wings. Crewmen chalk names on combings, home states, sweethearts, inside jokes. Someone paints a small pelican on a ramp hinge. Someone else pockets a sliver of plywood as a talisman. In a wardroom gray with cigarette haze, a staff officer taps a pencil against the table. We have to land without a port. Heads nod. They all look at the maps, but in their minds they are seeing boats. 200 yards of water, a minute and a half from plant to back out. The difference between a workable chaos and a massacre. Back in New Orleans, night shift blows out of the plant into humid dark, lunch pails swinging, the smell of varnish and sawdust baked into the seams of their clothes. A foreman locks the main door and listens to the far-off pulse of a freight train, carrying what his hands made toward a sea his eyes will never see. The city hums, unconcerned. The river keeps its brown counsel. On someone's desk, a telegram waits with a number on it that is not an order but a kind of oath. This many boats by this date, or some boy will stand behind a steel ramp with less than a fighting chance. When the transports finally ring the coast of Normandy and a bayou kid named Boudreaux leans into a tiller he trusts more than his luck, all these threads pull tight. Training, labor, doctrine, plywood and oak, the curve of a prop tunnel learned in swamp water, the barked orders of a man who would not stop swearing at problems until they quit. All of it converges into a single movement. Drop the ramp, step into history, back out. Do it again. June 6, 1944. Earth 6, 35 hours. Transport area, off Utah Beach. A low gray ceiling presses the channel flat as a mess tin. Boats nose away from their mothers like ducklings. LCVPs in staggered files, bows squared, ramps chained shut, each one with a chalk mark and a destiny. Motor machinists mate. First Class Eddie Salazar wipes his palms on his foul-weather jacket and eases the gray marine up to a steady growl. His bowman, Seaman Bob Weems, Texas drawl, fresh scar under his chin from a winch bite in training, leans forward, eyes narrowed. Ahead, a chain of marker buoys shows the lane the Naval Combat Demolition Units bled to open at first light. Charges and Bangalore torpedoes ripping the Hedgehogs and Belgian gates into crooked usable gaps. A gull wheels over the surf like it owns peace. The beach denies it with a single long burst from somewhere in a dune. 2 minutes, Salazar shouts. In the well, the 1st Platoon of the 8th Infantry Regiment, 4th Division, crouches in a wedge of silence. Through the slit above the ramp, the world is a strip of spray and dun-colored sand. A figure stands where no one sane should stand, stocky, cane in hand, helmet pushed back. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., calm as a man about to give a speech. It is said he rode in on one of these boats and, stepping into the shallows, glanced left and right at landmarks he did not find, because the tide and the wind pushed the assault 1,000, 2,000 yards south. "We'll start the war from right here," he told the beachmaster, which is another way of saying the boats had done their job. Get men ashore where you can, then turn a mistake into a plan. Salazar feels the cross-set tugging his stern. He feathers the throttle, lets the last shoulder of water push him the final yards, and plants clean. Ramp! The cable sings through the sheave. The steel door drops. The sea rushes in ankle deep and then out again as boots splash. A corporal's hand slaps the combing in thanks without words. Weems kicks the cable drum to keep it honest. The winch squeals, the door comes up dripping. Reverse, rudder, a crabwise slide, and the little boat backs off as if the beach were a barge and courtesy demanded a bow. Soit 7. 10 hours. Off. Fox Green, Omaha Beach. Omaha is a different conversation, noisy, rude, full of interruptions. The bluffs are teeth, the draws are throats, and every throat is blocked. LCVPs in the approach lanes pitch through a chop that seems to rise from the seafloor in anger. Petty Officer, Coast Guard, Frank Kowalski, a coxswain with grease under every fingernail he owns, watches stakes bristling with mines lean in the swell like a forest of bad intentions. He's delivered 2 waves already, and both times has backed into a rip that wanted to turn him broadside. The cove names, dog green, easy red, sound gentle until you put a bow on them. Down the safe lane, Navy NCDU men lie still in the shallows, bodies tangled in wire they were cutting minutes ago. Their charges blew gaps. The sea took the rest. Kowalski angles his approach to use one such gap, a triangle of water between a Belgian gate and a hedgehog stump wrapped in seaweed, and for a heartbeat, the war is pure geometry. He plants soft, drops the door, and a staff sergeant with the 16th Infantry, 1st Division, yells his men forward through sheets of machine gun fire that stitch the water low and merciless. Someone falls in the door and scrambles. Another man in the bow reaches down, hauls him up with a fist in his web gear, and shoves him out like they practiced with cardboard targets and whistles. The boat exhales, grows light, and Kowalski taps reverse. The prop in its tunnel bites and throws a chocolate froth. The bow peels away. He catches a wave, rides it backward, and turns so quick the rudder thumps the stop. There are 100 ways to be wrong here. Seamanship is choosing none of them. 0840 hours. Juno's offing, off Corsul. Farther east, Canadian infantry and other craft, LCAs with their gentle sheer and boxy combings, take their places in the same grim grammar. LCVPs shuttle stores into the wakes of those first waves, deck planks polished by the souls of men who have crossed a strip of water and found that the land beyond has opinions. A beach group officer with the Royal Engineers notes in a little book that the American boats are ugly and miraculous, useful as mules, disrespectful of waves, obedient to throttle and nerve. He will not write the word beautiful, he will mean it anyway. Back at Utah, Salazar runs in again and again, a metronome of plywood, cable, and gasoline. The language becomes reflex. Read the tide line, surf the last roller, plant soft, ramp, men off, astern, up, turn, go. On his 4th trip, he carries a Jeep. Hull flexing under concentrated weight, the frames were braced to take. The driver sits with both hands on the wheel as if he could steer fate. When the door drops, he finds a gear and clatters down into France as if he were rolling off a ferry. The crowd of obstacles makes him zig. He zigzags with a grin anyway. Weems slaps the combing with the flat of his hand, a reflex older than words. 10:20 hours. Easy red. Omaha. For Kowalski, the day is measured in micro-decisions, whether to ride a comber's shoulder or cut across it, whether to nose past a busted hedgehog that might still be wired, whether to pause in the shallows to let a burst pass or to drop the door in spite of it and trust speed to answer lead. A German shell lands so close the concussion splits the world into white and nothing. When the sound returns, it comes as a whine like bees in a tin. The engine coughs, regains its rhythm. A bullet chews a groove in the starboard gunwale. The gunner squeezes, tracers skipping low and fast across water to swat at a muzzle flash in a slit that moves like a mouth. He will never know if he hit anything that mattered. He will remember the feel of the trigger and the heat of the barrel through his glove. By midday, Beachmasters do what magicians do: turn chaos into a cue, signal flags snap, bullhorns bark, "Get off my beach!" becomes a prayer and a joke and an order with the iron taste of truth in it. LCTs belch tanks, LSTs creep in daringly close and lower their doors like drawbridges to a castle no one granted them. Between those hulks, the LCVPs never stop, little ants walking the same crumb back and forth until the shape of a bridge emerges where there had only been water and will. In New Orleans that same hour, 5 time zones and a world away, night shift at City Park clocks out, day shift clocks in, and a foreman flicks the factory lights so the carpenter's chalk lines glimmer across another skeletonized hull. On a wall, someone has pinned a map with red thread stretched from the industrial canal to a point in France. The thread sags in the heat. The point does not move. June 6th, 1944. 16 hours. Omaha. A lull that isn't one slips over the beach. Smoke sits in the draws like old glue. The tide, which served men like a conveyor in the morning, now punishes them by lifting every stranded object and shifting it sideways. Busted obstacles, wrecked boats, bodies. Beach engineers with bulldozers, water to their axles, exhaust barking, shove lanes through the wreckage. A coxswain from another flotilla, Navy coxswain Harold Denton, 18 months in, Nebraska farm kid, brings in water cans and Bangalore torpedoes and an artillery forward observer who keeps his map case chained to his chest like it were oxygen. The observer steps down, turns, and thumps the combing twice with his fist. The smallest ritual in an enormous day. June 7th, 1944. Dawn. Off Vierville. Boudreaux, his hands still nicked raw from winch cable and 24 trips more than any sane man should make in a single rotation, rides a long, low swell toward a shore that has lost some of its meanness without forgetting it. Yesterday was bullets. Today is tonnage, crates of rations, jerrycans, Bailey bridge panels, square and purposeful, rolls of wire, a chaplain, a bulldozer driver who has not slept. The boat takes it all, voice deepening under weight, and keeps her manners. On the bluffs, men with yesterday's sand still glued to their elbows are turning fields into assembly areas and hedgerow paths into exits with names D1, E1 that will become simple nouns on maps. Out beyond the surf, a forest is growing, the blocky silhouettes of gooseberry breakwaters, scuttled block ships, and the first caissons of a harbor no one on this sea had the time or the gall to build before they needed it. Salazar, off Utah, can feel the rhythm changing too. Fewer bursts, more whistles. Beachmasters plant signboards that say ammo, med, ENGR, and the little boats begin to carry not just men into a fight, but the specific fussy commas and semicolons that let a sentence keep going. Nails, wire, morphine, radio batteries, spare magnetos, a cook's ladle discovered in a crate and treasured like contraband. Here and there, beside a lane, a wrecked LCVP lies with its bow at an odd angle, ramp torn off, ribs showing through scuffed paint, numbers half hidden under salt and smoke. No one salutes a wreck. They step around it and get on with the arithmetic. By dusk on D+1, a statistician could make a graph that would break your heart and also tell you something simple. The boats went in, and they kept going in, until the beach was no longer the edge of a world, but its beginning. Somewhere in London, a planner who stared at tables for a year rubs his eyes, listens to a report that says throughput, and allows himself a single nod. Somewhere in New Orleans, Higgins throws his hat on a desk, barks at someone about hinge deliveries, and, when no one is looking, puts a palm on a fresh-laid ramp the way a father might touch a child's shoulder before sending him out the door. On the water, where all arithmetic resolves into wave and wake, Boudreaux lines up again. Kowalski checks his cable with a fingertip to feel if the strands are talking about giving up. Salazar slides his bow into the exact same rut of sand he made in the morning, and feels absurdly that he has come home to a place that has never known the word. The little boats run and run and run until the language of an amphibious nation finds its next clause. A harbor built from nothing, a road pushed across fields, a fight that has to be fed past dawn. June 8, 1944. Off Arromanches-les-Bains. The sea is a work site now, buoys pricked into grids, tugs chuffing like patient oxen, and hulks with names still painted on their sterns being nudged toward a last deliberate death. Jack Boudreaux idles his LCVP in the lee of a British tug, while a signalman on the tug's bridge chops the air with flags. Ahead slow, starboard 2. The old cargo ship staggers, then leans as explosives kiss her ribs. She settles with a sound like a sigh, bow pointing seaward, stern toward France. A line of them, gooseberries they call them, will become the backbone of a breakwater in hours. A necklace of block ships scuttled to make a calm where none exists. Beyond the hulks, concrete mountains creep in under tow. Phoenix caissons, poured in Britain, each as tall as a church and pocked with openings like a beehive. They ride low and stubborn, slate gray, their sharp shoulders making their own weather. On their decks stand men in duffels, hands in pockets, measuring France with their eyes as if considering real estate. Heave! A bosun bellows and cables groan. The sea pulls its shoulder into the job. The caisson slides onto its marks and begins to sink, exactly where a pencil said it must. The tops will stand above the tide, a wall reaching east and west, turning a bight of coast into a roadstead. Boudreaux ferries the small things that make big things true, surveyors with white-capped poles, boxes of chain shackles greased like pastries, a kettle for tea because the Royal Navy is here and reality must be civilized. He noses alongside a pontoon with a ring of fresh burnt weld and holds steady while a British lieutenant commander with a pencil mustache steps aboard. "Aeromanches," the officer says to no one in particular, to the sea itself. Port Winston. He says it like a toast. His name is Alan Beckett, the engineer whose sketch of a floating roadway on spidery legs is becoming lumber and steel. To the men with salt on their cuffs, he is simply the bloke marking angles with a grease pencil and nodding when the tide lifts and drops his design without complaint. The floating roadways are called whales, long steel trusses riding on box pontoons known as beetles. At their sea ends, they plug into pierheads on spud legs that climb and descend with the tide like measured pistons. From shore to pierhead runs a zigzag of whale spans, held by anchors shaped like flying kites that bite deeper the harder the sea pulls. The names sound like nursery rhyme, the math does not. Get one angle wrong and bolts carry loads they cannot stand. Get it right and trucks will roll out into the channel and back again as if on a pier laid by Romans. June 12th, Omaha offing. On the American beach, the same sorcery is performed with different hands and a slightly different grammar. Seabees, naval construction battalions with sleeves rolled and cigarettes stuck to their lips by habit, swing sledgehammers at pins the thickness of a man's wrist. Chief Carpenter's mate, Red Malloy, who built houses in Baton Rouge before he built causeways in a war, points with a chisel, "Set your beetle there. No, let the swell bring it to you." He has learned to talk to the sea like an apprentice you cannot fire. Boudreaux runs his LCVP as a courier between elements, tugs, caissons, rhino ferries. Rhinos are made from steel pontoon boxes lashed into platforms, pushed by tugs, or driven by outboards bristling like quills. They carry trucks and bulldozers the way a father carries children, close, protective, impatient with delay. When a rhino noses into a gap, soldiers on the beach wave arms and semaphore. Left, left, hold. Down ramp, steady. A truck coughs, finds second, and crawls down into France. An LCVP riding shotgun idles, then darts in to retrieve a dropped coil of rope because somewhere, later, that rope will be the difference between a problem and a fix. The beach parties have a new religion: throughput. Beachmasters, megaphones in hand, tempers flayed to the nerve, turn men with boats into clerks of a moving warehouse. Chalkboards sprout at the waterline, ammo this way, Médée that way, Pioneer tools there. Boudreaux brings in tins of petrol, a crate of radio batteries, a priest, anchor cable, hot tea, 3 men with slide rules and grease under their nails, and one half-drowned dog that rides the bow like he owns the joint. The dog, recognizing something eternal in the LCVP's flat, noble snout, stays. June 14th. Aeromanches. The first trucks roll out onto a whale. Their tires hum on steel grating. Off to the left, bombardons, vast floating steel cruciforms, ride outside the Phoenix line like a second elastic breakwater, taking the punch out of swells before they poke the harbor's ribs. Every piece flexes where it should, stays put where it must. A British staff officer with a clipped voice notes in his book, Pier B operational. Throughput acceptable. Increasing. He does not look up when a truck thunks across a joint and the whole structure sighs like a living thing. His job is to count. A coxswain's job is to read the sea. Between the two of them, a continent gets fed. Boudreaux makes a medevac run. His ramp now a stretcher tray. 2 men in blankets lie with their boots still muddy from hedgerows. A third sits upright, holding a bandage against his ear as if it were a secret. A boat that delivered riflemen in the morning can become an ambulance in the afternoon and a mail truck by dusk. Every part of her is sentenced to purpose. The ramp, the flat deck, the tunneled prop that lets her back away from whatever she just solved. June 19th, the storm. At first the wind speaks soft, and then decides to shout. Flags snap flat. The sky goes the color of pewter that remembers thunder. Within hours, harbor becomes maelstrom. Swells reach with long arms into places that were calm the day before and shake everything as if to see what is glued. Phoenixes shoulder water and throw it aside, but it climbs and climbs. Whales bounce and flex, bolts singing. Beetles heave, lines thrumming to a single low note. On the American beach, the Omaha mulberry takes the blows hard. White water tears at pierheads and at joints you cannot reach when you most want to. Rhinos cut loose, drifting like ungainly rafts toward the west. A block ship breaks her back with a sound heard inland, a church organ breaking itself. Boudreaux spends a whole dark cycle of hours playing shepherd in a kindergarten of giants. He ferries a spud leg crew to a pierhead that's riding too high on its piles and threatening to tear. The men clank up iron ladders, nimble as cats, mallets and belts. He carries a line from a tug to a beetle that is fetched up where it never should. Twice he takes his boat under a whale span because a man on it waved and because his choices are help or watch something fail. The LCVP slides in, small and certain, and for a moment it is the only thing in sight that's behaving. When the wind shifts a quarter point, he feels it through the tiller like a change in a friend's voice. The storm eats 3 days. Off Omaha, the American mulberry is declared a loss, a carcass of twisted truss and stranded beetles left like a lesson. The sea does not sign your plans. Off Arromanches, the British port. Winston survives bruised and working, the geometry having been set where the seabed's temperament proved kinder, the lines a hair different, the luck better. When the wind at last makes its apology and crawls back under the horizon, the surviving harbor stands with a lordly tilt, patched and worthy. On the beaches, doctrine changes overnight. If you cannot land over the broken piers, you land through surf the old way, by patience, by muscle, by repetition. LSTs edge in closer, daring the sandbars. WKWs, amphibious trucks with the prettiest stupidity the war ever cherished, trundle cargo through the shallows in lines that look like circus acts. And the LCVPs go back to multiplication. Loads small enough to keep the light craft tame, trips fast enough to make tonnage matter. The boats are not insulted by the change, they were never proud, only useful. June 23rd, Omaha. Red Malloy's Seabees stand in a ring around a beetle their rhino ferry nudged into position again, lids of coffee cups pressed against their lips as if the sea might try to snatch even that. Malloy rubs stubble, squints at a new angle scribbled on a torn envelope, and nods. "We'll use the causeways," he says, meaning pontoon strings chained from LSTs right into the tide. A causeway isn't elegant, but it's obedient to the one commander who never loses: time. Trucks rumble down its length, tires hissing. An LCVP runs alongside like a sheepdog, collecting stray loads, nudging men where they need to be, tapping its ramp to let a crate half slide into a WKW's bed. No one in this choreographed mess thinks of beauty. Everyone moves inside a kind of grace. June 26th. Arromanches. At Port Winston, the repaired whales quiver under weight and then settle. The pierheads ride their spud legs with tired dignity. A British petty officer with tattoos like faded stamps taps the steel with a hammer, listening for the note that tells him the joint is true. The note rings dull. He frowns. He orders a bolt changed. Boudreaux ferries the bolt. It is the most important bolt in France for exactly 7 minutes. Far inland, along a sunken lane, a corporal of the 29th kneels with a map and a pencil that will not catch, because his hands shake. His platoon has food, ammo, and water, because somewhere behind him 100 small, ungainly miracles repeated themselves until a miracle felt like a system. He does not know the names, Phoenix, Whale, Beetle, Bombardin, or the man in New Orleans who swore a ramp into the bow of a swamp boat and told the ocean to mind itself. He knows only that yesterday there were too few of everything, and today there is more. Nights on the roadstead are lantern-lit factories, welders' arcs sputtering blue on whale joints, tug skippers swapping lies over enamel mugs, beachmasters pushing colored pins across maps as if razoring time into manageable slices. An LCVP's motor idles, then climbs, then idles again. Boudreaux keeping station under a pierhead while a chain is paid out, a knot understood, a curse refined to perfection. The little boat's paint flakes from the combing in a pattern that looks like scales. Beneath it, the wood is wet and honest. He puts a hand on the ramp's edge and lets the thrum of his engine travel up his bones. "Funny little ship," says a royal engineer, stepping down into the well with a tin of biscuits under his arm. "Not a ship," Boudreaux says without looking up. "A boat," he smiles. "The distinction matters because the boat does something ships cannot. It erases the last 100 yards of war, the place where maps stop and sand begins. It makes a door where there was an edge. Port Winston will work for months, swallowing weather and regurgitating trucks and tins until autumn gales close its throat. The American beach will make itself a harbor by habit, by growing conveyors of causeway and sand and muscle. In both places, the small rectangles of deck with their steel smiles will keep the sentences of the campaign moving forward. Later, men in clean collars will assign numbers and write histories. In this moment, the only count that matters is the next load and the one after. Boudreaux noses the LCVP into a gap tight enough to shave paint and holds her there with snips of throttle. Above him, a sergeant in a lorry grinds a gear and yells at the gear as if it were a mule. The sea breathes, the harbor flexes, the pierhead sighs, and France inches closer to belonging to itself again. The little boat listens to all of it and when asked says yes. July 1st, 1944, Port Winston, Arromanches. The harbor breathes like a giant with a cracked rib, working but with the memory of pain. Dawn lays pewter on the whales, beetles lift and bow, the phoenixes shoulder a lazy swell that no longer wants to fight. Jack Boudreaux trims his throttle and slides his LCVP alongside a pierhead where a royal engineer in oilskins leans over with a wrench the size of a rifle. "Hold her there, mate!" Boudreaux kisses the combing to steel, nudging with bursts of prop until the man can drop down. The engineer's boots hit the deck with a dull drum. "Bolt change," he says, as if the whole war had boiled down to threads per inch. On the beach, the language has shifted from assault to throughput. Chalkboards become signposts, signposts become habits. A convoy of Bedford lorries thumps across the roadways, tarpaulins snapping. Farther east, the American beach shakes off the storm's insult and acts like a port by sheer stubbornness. Causeways chained to LSTs, DUKWs waddling with artillery rounds and flour, bulldozers purring like contented cats as they scrape new lanes into old sand. The LCVPs work the seams, where a crate fell wrong, where a nurse needs a quick run to a hospital ship, where a beachmaster points with two fingers and a threat. The little boats are at their best here in the small fixes that add up to big math. Boudreaux ferries a load you couldn't plan on. 3 radio men, a crate of spare valves, a chaplain with a tobacco tin full of notes for men he will not find today, and a cook who guards a box labeled eggs as if it contained the armistice. The LCVP lifts, slaps, corrects. The coxswain watches the tide line, dark water where the slope changes, and rides the last roller in like a commuter who knows the stop by smell. He plants soft, the ramp slaps down, the cook steps ashore with the eggs and a grin that outlasts wars. A private nearby whispers, "That boat'll take you to hell and back." His sergeant, who remembers Omaha at 7:30, says, "Only if you deserve the ride." July 25th, 1944. St. Osote. Low breakout. Inland, where hedgerows make geography into chess, the sky erupts as bombers lay a carpet that will open a seam in the German line. Along the coast, pierheads tremble with the weight of trucks rolling faster now. Gasoline in jerry cans, 105-meter shells in wooden crates, K-rations by the pyramid. Beachmasters push pins to the south, then more pins. By dusk, the pins begin to move on their own. Convoy blue, convoy red, traffic like blood cells in new veins. A major with the Transportation Corps runs a thumb down a clipboard and nods as if he had ordered the sun to set and it obeyed. Boudreaux spends a night moving medics and bandaged men between a hospital ship and a beach that smells like iodine and diesel. A nurse thanks him with a squeeze on the forearm and a "God love your boat." He wants to say the boat belongs to a man in New Orleans who cursed a ramp into the future, but the engine rattles into idle and the moment goes by. August 15th, 1944. Cavalaire-sur-Mer, southern France, Operation Dragoon. Different sea, different light. The Mediterranean lifts blue and friendly until flak turns it into a mirror of brass. Coxswains who cut their teeth on Channel Chop grin when they see the water here. Then they sober at the sight of points bristling with gun pits that look like thumbs on a fist. In one LCVP, Ensign Ruthven Rufus Carr, naval reservist, Baton Rouge math teacher in civilian life, runs a lane toward the pale crescent south of Saint-Tropez. Beside him, a free French guide stares at the hills as if reading scripture. The ramp drops. Algerian tirailleurs pour out at a jog, shouting to each other in Arabic and French, their rifle slings tight and neat. The boat backs out, as reliable as a comma in a long sentence. Dragoon is a study in what happens when you bring the correct nouns. Boats, lanes, timing, doctrine. The beaches here give ground more politely than Normandy did. The defenders sputter and recede like surf. But the small precisions matter as much as ever. At day's end, Carr noses his LCVP alongside a Rhino loaded with a bulldozer whose operator wears a bandana and a grin. "First one in gets to name the road," the man yells. "We'll call it Louisiana Avenue," Carr fires back. Names matter, so do roads. September 15th, 1944, Holland. Scheldt approaches, rehearsals. Up in the gray of the North Sea world, Royal Navy crews practice riverine landings where tides run like rivers and sandbanks move like rumors. LCVPs, American-built, British-crewed, paint scuffed to an honorable dull, pluck commandos from saltwater and put them on dikes like chessmen. The coxswain's eyes live in the corner of the tide, in the push on the stern that wants to make a fool of straight lines. In pilot houses and well decks, accents knot together into one shared grammar. Plant, drop, reverse, clear. Men from Glasgow and Grimsby develop a respect for the weird, blunt American boat that shrugs at sand and rides a sliver of water like a starling's shadow. October 20th, 1944. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. On the other side of a war that spans maps like a rumor, the Pacific receives LCVPs with a nod as if recognizing kin. The sky is a kiln, the water a green pavement scribed with coral. In the well of one boat, Private First Class Nestor Valdez of the 24th Infantry Division feels his boots stick to a deck warmed by the sun since breakfast. The coxswain, a Coast Guardsman out of Astoria, Oregon, has learned the reefs pull the hard way and keeps to a channel like a train on a timetable. Ramp! Valdez steps into a warm surf and finds himself in a jungle that smells like forever. The LCVP is not the only amphib tool here. LVTs crawl where boats cannot. But the little ramped skiff keeps doing what it always does, feeding the edges of impossible. It brings riflemen where sand will let them run, hauls water cans past splinters of mangrove, retrieves the wounded with the ramp flat like an altar. At night, the coxswain throttles down to a whisper to dodge phosphorescence that would ink his wake on black water for any watching eye. Downslope from coconut fronds, you can hear boats more than see them. A careful murmur, an engine that speaks throttle in a shy voice, the soft percussion of water against plywood ribs. Back in New Orleans, the factories push past fatigue into the simple arithmetic of more. The Michoud plant, where Marsh once shrugged at mosquitoes, glows all night. Women with kerchiefs knotting their hair feed panels into jigs. Black welders run beads that look like rope. Creole carpenters shave fits you could swear were impossible. On a bulletin board, a supervisor pins a letter. A coxswain from somewhere in France thanks whoever fitted the winch on boat 26-413. She never slipped when I asked her to hold. The letter is read aloud twice on the floor. Men grin and then go back to pretending they are too busy to grin. October, late. Cherbourg Roadstead. Tugs nudge Liberty ships into berths reclaimed from ruin. Cranes wake from wreckage and begin to lift like birds taught a trick. LCVPs swarm between hulls and stone like working bees. A French docker stands on a quay with his cap pushed back and watches a Higgins boat back out with such neatness that he claps once without meaning to. Petite, he says approvingly, mais courageuse. Small, but brave. The coxswain does not hear. He is already sliding toward a buoy line that might as well be a rail yard schedule. By autumn, the little boats have taken on the unshowy heroism of habit. They are where they ought to be. At the waterline between large events, correcting small mistakes, erasing edges, making doors where edges used to be. Their crews develop a superstition about the first plan of the morning. If it's clean, the day will forgive. They develop a ritual about touching the ramp hinge with a boot heel before raising it, as if waking an old friend. They talk about nothing and everything. Coffee, home, the way the channel smells different in rain, the difference between French and Norman cows, the rumor that the man who designed this box with the steel grin curses like a poet and hires like a saint. A staff officer in a villa that used to belong to someone with a monocle writes a line in a report. Amphibious transfer capacity remains the pacing item. The sentence is bloodless and correct. It cannot hear the scrape of a skeg on sand or the drumbeat of boots over a ramp or the way a coxswain swallows when he sees a man hesitate at the door and says, "Go! Go!" in a voice that makes the water less cold. At night, Boudreaux sits on the combing and smokes, the ember a small star. He thinks of Lake Pontchartrain. He thinks of a foreman with a hammer who rapped a joint and listened to the note. He thinks of the day the storm tried to take the harbor and failed. He thinks, too, of men who stepped down his ramp and did not step back up. The boat creaks in the way a wooden thing does when it is dry on top and wet beneath. A living sound. He pats the ramp with two knuckles. A benediction. "Good girl," he says, and if someone hears him, they pretend they did not. A continent is being supplied, a front is bending, and history is learning to pronounce new place names. St. Lo, Falaise, Antwerp, Aachen. Each name hides a tally of trips, thousands of small repeating gestures across the last 100 yards. When people later say D-Day, they will imagine a single morning. The men with throttles under their palms know it lasted all summer. November 1st, 1944. West Capella, Walcheren Island, Netherlands. Rain drives sideways across the North Sea and the dikes look like wet slate. A Royal Navy flotilla noses in on a coastline that has been turned into a moat. The RAF blew gaps in the dikes to drown German guns, and now every approach is water, mud, and sudden depth. In an American-built LCVP with paint scuffed to primer, leading seaman Tom Kershaw keeps one hand on the throttle and one on the tiller bar, eyes flicking between a ruined lighthouse and a white-painted range stake jammed into a dike like a toothpick. In the well, Number 4 Commando crouches in cap comforters and assault vests, Bren guns wrapped in oilcloth. A Churchill Aver lumbers past in an LCT, turret buttoned up, fascine bundle tied like a hay bale on its nose. The sea smells of peat and cordite and something sour that might be drowned pasture. "Mind the eddy!" a beach pilot shouts from a motor launch, cupping his hands into a horn. Kershaw feels it before he hears it. The stern wants to kick toward a scoured hole where the dike burst. He feathers the throttle and lets the bow slide a boat's width to port, then plants. The ramp goes down and commandos spill into a world without edges. Brown water, churned mud, dike crest. A German MG opens, flat and angry. Kershaw drops a hand, the winch chatters, and the steel door scrawls up the frame trailing weeds. He reverses into chop that tastes of winter and grit. Farther along, other boats do the same, a necklace of blunt mouths opening and closing on a flooded island that guards the Scheldt. The day earns Antwerp a harbor again, and the little American boats, under British hands, learn that a dike can be a beach if you insist. January 9th, 1945, Lingayen Gulf, Luzon. Different water, different war. The sunrise is the color of a brass coin. Mountains stand blue and sharp behind a long, pale beach. Kamikaze smoke still smudges the horizon where a destroyer burned all night, and the Gulf smells faintly of gasoline and hibiscus crushed under boot. Coxswain Eddie Salazar, pulled from Normandy to a Pacific squadron, his hands tanned to leather, checks the line of his wave. The guide boat shows a bright flag. Off to starboard, an LST lowers its ramp and berths a string of DUKWs like ducklings. 2 minutes, he yells. The 37th Infantry boys in his well-tightened straps and pull-at web belts, M1s tucked close. A Filipino scout in the front rank squints into the wind and grins at the shape of home. The run-in is clean, no reef to bite the keel, just a low swell and the whisper of sandbars. Salazar rides the last roller, plants soft and drops the door. Boots patter, then thump onto a beach as broad as a boulevard. A mortar coughs from behind palms, but the fire is thin. Surprised, the bowman kicks the winch, the ramp smiles shut, and the LCVP slides back like a crab. Lingayen will take days and blood, counter-battery, inland fights, bridges thrown over rivers with names the coxswain will never learn. But the first sentence lands with an easy verb. Ashore. Salazar makes a second run with a load that looks like an overfilled pantry. Medical chests, radio valves, a canvas sack of fresh mail, and a chaplain whose collar asks the sea for mercy without expecting it. On the third, he carries a jeep and a crate of 81 mm mortar rounds stacked like loaves. When the ramp drops, the driver nudges forward as though rolling off a ferry on Lake Pontchartrain. Salazar watches the tires nip at ruts, grins despite himself, and backs out, grateful for the boat's old manners in this new light. February 7th, 1945. Scheldt Estuary, Antwerp approaches. Back in Europe's gray mouth, the waters work again. With Walcheren taken, the river's throat opens. Tugs shove Liberty hulls toward piers that were rubble in October. Cranes wake up, creaking like old men. LCVPs swarm between hulls and key like bees in a hive. Pilots, putting stevedores where they need to be, dropping off winch grease, collecting a doctor for a man whose finger learned a bad lesson about cable drums. A Belgian docker in a cap claps once at a neat back out and mutters, "Petite mais courageuse," small but brave. The coxswain cannot hear him over the gray marine's hum. He is already sliding into the next lane, eyes on a signal flag that tells him which gap is his. March 20 out in the 24, 1945, the Rhine. The river is too wide, too fast, and too certain of itself. It runs pewter and cold under a sky the color of unpolished steel. Engineers have trucked LCVPs overland, decks chained to lowboys, props wrapped against dust, and slid them into German water as if they were back at Solomon's for a school they never expected to reopen here. On the west bank, infantry crouch under willow branches and sandbag revetments. On the east bank, there is a low, patient flash of muzzle fire from hedges and a farm lane that leads to a village name no one wants to pronounce wrong on the radio. Corporal Sam Rizzo of the 5th Infantry Division tightens his life belt and glances at the coxswain. A Navy petty officer with stripes washed almost white by soap and river water. A man who looks like he'd rather be on any sea, any time, than anywhere else. "Keep low when we hit," the petty officer says, voice flat as advice. He checks his bilge pump, sets his jaw, and reads the current with the disbelieving respect a bayou man gives the Mississippi in flood. The river pushes hard on the stern. The bow wants to crab. He lets it, then corrects with a double tap of throttle and a kiss of rudder. The boat slides into a black seam where the flow is slower. On their left, assault boats, canvas-sided, oars flashing, buck and sleigh ride. The LCVP makes her own stubborn weather. Ramp! Rizzo is on his feet before the word finishes. The steel door hits a clay bank with a thunk that feels private. Men spill forward into reeds and soft earth, then up, always up, through a fringe of willows toward a lane that smells of manure and cold smoke. Mortars begin their punctuation from the far side. A machine gun skims the bank and learns nothing today. In the river, the coxswain is already backing out, stern biting water the color of old coins, eyes darting for driftwood and the slick shape of something that could be a mine and could be a log. He swings wide, turns hard, and his boat takes a slap from a cross eddy with the offended dignity of a mule thumped on the haunch. All along the river, near Oppenheim, north of Wesel, at little bends with names map clerks love, engineer special brigades run LCVP ferries and relays, night folding over the water until wakes shine with foxfire. The boats carry regiments by the paragraph, riflemen first, then mortars and radios, then jeeps nosed in, sideways with their exhausts gagging on spray. When a ramp sticks because cold mud has a mind, a deckhand taps the hinge with a hammer like a priest ringing a bell. Wake up now. When a bow hangs on a root and will not let go, the coxswain lets the current do half the work and the boat slides free because it hates being told no. March 24th, across from Wesel. The night is punctured by the thunder of varsity, the airborne drop rolling like a drumline beyond the far bank. The river smells of cordite and sap where shells cut trees and make them bleed. In one LCVP, Seaman Apprentice Walt McKee, 19 Cleveland, grew up on lake water and streetcar air, stares at the backs of men he's seen at breakfast and will not see again by supper. He nudges the throttle, counts seconds against his own breath, and feels the boat's skegs whisper to him through the tiller. Angle now, he does. The bow kisses a gravel bar, the ramp drops, and the company is gone into Germany while the fog oozes like a lie. On the near bank, the queue never stops. A captain with an engineer battalion waves a lighted wand like a conductor. Next, keep the nose out of the drift. You, watch your line. A corporal stumbles aboard with a spool of field wire on his shoulder like a yoke. A runner with a message for an artillery liaison officer puts the paper in his teeth to free both hands and clambers over the coaming with a grunt. McKee thinks of a letter he meant to write and did not, of a girl who sometimes answers and sometimes doesn't, and of a smell like his grandfather's basement. Wet wood, old varnish, the breath of a boat that has always lived half in the water, half out. By dawn, bridges of Bailey steel begin to crawl out across the river, like carpenter's toys scaled for giants. Ferries, LCM, LCVP, even battered civilian punts pressed to war, keep at it as if they sense that bridges are promises and boats are the only sentences that pay on time. On the east bank, first light finds men who have slept in ditches and hedges, in the shallow bowls of shell craters keeping their helmets low, while coffee simmers in a canteen cup balanced on a candle stub. A private digs a chocolate bar out of a pocket and breaks it with a thumbnail. "Tastes like a bridge," he says, and laughs with his mouth closed. Between jobs, the coxswains talk in the language of water, the way this river pulls and that one shoves, how the Rhine smells different from the Channel, how mud can make a hinge into a lyre. Someone mentions the man in New Orleans who hired anybody who could swing a hammer and cursed at problems until they walked away. Someone else taps the ramp with a boot heel, habit turning into ritual, ritual into luck. A petty officer climbs up on the coaming, stretches his back, and looks east with a face that gives up nothing. "One more," he says, and means 10. News comes garbled and late and sideways the way it always does. A bridge held at Remagen. Patton wet to the waist at Oppenheim and proud of it. Montgomery crossing on a timetable that made staff officers purr. Somewhere, a town taken twice because the first time didn't stick. The river does not care. The boats care, and that is enough for now. In the Pacific, the same equipment is running other sentences. Zambales Mountains in the distance at Subic Bay, navies breathing in and out like lungfish, plans written in grease pencil on a coaming and wiped away with a sleeve. The war is everywhere, and the little ramped box keeps finding edges and erasing them. By March's end, the LCVP has delivered men to dikes and deltas, to sugar sand and river muck, to the first step of roads that go inland and do not stop until cities no one thought would fall say yes. In planners' files later there will be charts, throughput, tonnage, sortie rates. In memory there will be other tallies, how many times a ramp went down and a man set his boots on something he had never touched before, how many times a coxswain used a breath to count a wave and made it look easy. How many edges were turned into doors by a boat designed on a lake and built in a city that lives on tide? April 1st, 1945. 0830 hours. Hagushi Beaches, Okinawa. The Pacific sky is rinsed clean, a flawless blue that makes men suspicious. Beyond the surf, a procession of hulls fills the horizon. Attack transports, LSTs with their mouths shut, rocket ships bristling, destroyers in a nervous picket ring. The preliminary rocket barrage coughs itself hoarse along the shoreline. Dust hangs where villages used to be. In an LCVP edged into Wave 3, coxswain Eddie Salazar tastes salt and cordite and the warm metallic tang of oil from 1,000 engines. His bowman, Seaman Bob Weems, brought west by orders and habit, leans on the combing, eyes picking a lane through shoals and stakes in the ghosts of rumor. The run-in is almost indecently smooth. The reef here gives them a gutter to follow, and the tide, for once, obeys. 2 minutes, Salazar calls. In the well, men of the 7th Infantry Division crouch over M1s and bars, packs squared to their shoulders, grenades taped, faces calm in the way that is not calm at all. A Navy beachmaster's voice rips across the water from a bullhorn. Green 2, keep it moving. Salazar rides the last roller, plants soft, and drops the ramp. Boots patter down steel and into sand that feels, in that first moment, like a road home. The Marines ashore find an undefended beach and a killing ground set inland. The Army finds lanes into cane fields and low ridges. Okinawa will be a long, terrible sentence, but its first verb is easy, ashore. Behind the veneer of calm sits the war's ugliest surprise. The sky will be the enemy. Offshore, radar picket destroyers fight for their lives. By dusk, smoke smudges 3 horizons where kamikaze smashed metal into fire. The boats feel the air raids as tremors in the routine. Sirens that don't quite reach the beach, a blackout that turns a surf line into a rumor. Smoke generators stain the water gray. Through it, the LCVPs behave as they always do. Carry, plant, back, repeat. They bring riflemen, then radio batteries, then water cans and litters, then chaplains and stretchers, and a box labeled "Dental Do Not Drop." Because even in hell, a man's tooth can choose the wrong hour to revolt. April 2-3. Karama-Redo. The little archipelago west of Okinawa becomes the fleet's lungs. Seabees turn coves into repair yards. Tenders raft up like country cousins at a church picnic. Gasoline floats on water in dangerous rainbows. LCVPs move as couriers in a town that floats, ferrying divers in rubber hoods, hauling a generator whose only label is "She's Temperamental," dragging a damaged 40mm Bofors barrel like a dog on a leash. A coxswain from San Pedro ties up under a tender's shadow and listens to men talk about holes punched by planes that never got a name. He drops his ramp so a man with a tool roll can step aboard and asks no questions he cannot bear hearing answered. April 16th, 1945, Ishima. The sea is a glossy green, beautiful enough to be impolite. Salazar noses his LCVP toward a narrow beach under low bluffs. Mortars cough from somewhere left. A burst of machine gun fire scribbles questions onto the shallows. The Marines step down in a practiced rush. Later, an LCVP will carry a wounded correspondent back through the chop. Ernie Pyle, slumped under a poncho, a man who had typed the war into sentences so plain they shone. The boat will ride carefully, bow up, as if posture alone could undo what a single moment of chance has done. In after-action reports, Ayeshima will be a thumb on a map, useful for an airstrip secured in days. In memory, it will be a small, bright ache. April 6-7, Kikusui 1 and 2. The sky breaks its promise all at once. Hundreds of kamikaze pour down the map. Val dive bombers and Zeeks loaded past Sense, with pilots staring through windscreens that show them their last horizon. Picket destroyers burst into roasted silhouettes. A carrier blisters at the edges. LSTs burn until their decks buckle like bread. On the Hagushi roadstead, boat crews watch the air attackers through gaps in smoke they helped lay and feel very small and very necessary. Salazar runs ammunition to a 90mm battery, the army parked in sand that still remembers the sea. He brings back wounded, shirts cut open, battle dressings bleeding through. On one run, a Zero cartwheels into the shallows 1,000 yards north, throws fuel and shrapnel into the air, and leaves silence so loud it hurts. The boat keeps her manners, the ramp drops, men move, the landing craft take their strange share. A kamikaze, crippled by flak, skips into the water and barrels under the surface like a thrown boulder. The shock lifts 3 LCVPs in a single indelicate shrug. One drops its ramp by reflex and takes a wave across the deck. The bowman yanks the winch, the cable sings, the door lifts with a groan like a soaked hinge on a barn. The coxswain taps the throttle and finds the prop still speaking through the tunnel. He grins at the stubbornness of things built to be stubborn. As the front creeps south into the Shuri line, through low hills and wet ravines and caves that inhale grenades and exhale silence, the LCVPs adopt new chores. They become ambulances across lagoon mouths. They become the last step in a supply chain that begins in California and ends at a foxhole with a man who needs fresh socks and new courage. They carry Marines to outflanks so tight you could draw them with a carpenter's pencil and haul engineers with Bangalore torpedoes thick as a man's thigh. At dusk, they nose into marshy sloughs to collect litters while night flyers drone over the lines and the horizon mumbles with artillery. May 3, 4, Kikusui 5. The fleet rides at anchor like a city that forgot how to sleep. Under the gray, the water becomes a pinball table of wakes and wakes on wakes. Salazar's boat carries a priest, a crate of sulfa powder, a radio repairman, and 2 coils of wire. He plants by a causeway the Seabees lashed to steel pontoons. Truck tires hiss across its grating. The priest gives the radio man a smile that is its own right. Offshore, a destroyer on picket station number 10 fights alone for minutes that feel like an hour. In the LCVP, the engine misses a beat, bad gas, and then clears its throat. Weems taps the carb with a wrench, listens, nods. The boat's pulse resumes. She is allowed 1 bad moment per day. Today she has used it. Far to the southwest, other LCVPs haunt other edges. Tarakan in Borneo, May. Labuan in Brunei Bay, June. Balikpapan, July. Australian infantry clatter over ramps under a tropical sun that makes shadows into knives. Mangrove swamps yawn into channels where a man can feel lost at noon. The boats bring sappers to timbered revetments and haul Gurkhas with knives that gleam without apology. In reports written in Englishes of several tempers, the adjective that returns is not flowery, reliable. June 21st, 1945, Southern Okinawa. The last positions crack. Rain turns trails into caramel. Bulldozers push spiteful mud aside with blade tips that glow in their own mythology. LCVPs ferry across the Baton Ko and toward the Chinan Peninsula, their heels whispering over sand with the casual competence of a trade learned long ago. Men who stepped onto these ramps in April lean against combings with faces older by a lifetime you cannot measure. And still the little boat is a kind of home because it keeps its promises. It will put you down, and it will come back. July Ferry, 1945, Balikpapan, Borneo. The sea is glass under a hot haze. An LCVP squats behind a line of LCIs shaped like old tenements. Naval gunfire has planed the beaches flat, but the near water hides oil-slick coral. Coxswain Walter McKee, his hands nicked, his stripes still barely new, steers by a line of smoke pots. He feels the tug of a set through the stern and lets the boat heel a whisper to it, the way a dancer lets a good partner lead for 1 beat before taking the next. The ramp drops. Australian infantry lope shoreward through water the color of a bottle. The boat backs clean. Prop still speaking good English through its tunnel. If anyone aboard has a spare thought, it is for rumor. Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan proper. Kyushu first, then Honshu. In the beach parties, men say Kagoshima and Ariake Wan, the way the European beachmasters said Vierville and Aramanches. Charts bloom on desks. The old arithmetic returns. Lanes, tides, cross sets, surf tables, throughput. In New Orleans, where war work has become the only work many people have known, the plant sirens still cut the day into 3 equal pieces, and LCVP frames still march down jigs like rows in a hymn. No one knows an August sun will change everything. Between runs, Salazar sits with his back against the ramp and eyes closed, counting the knocks and voices his boat makes. The tick of a cooling manifold, the rattle of a loose shackle he keeps meaning to replace, the faint complaining sigh of a cable that wants grease. He thinks of Lake Pontchartrain and a foreman with a hammer who tapped a joint and listened for truth. He thinks of a man in a loosened tie who hired everyone and swore at problems until they gave up. He touches the ramp hinge with 2 knuckles, a habit that is no longer a joke. "Good girl," he says. The sea breathes. The boat answers by existing. Somewhere east, over water, a chart calls the Nanpo Shoto. A pilot adjusts mixture and leans on a throttle in a way that will matter to millions. For now, at the edge of Okinawa and Borneo and every beach where edges need erasing, the LCVP keeps true. She is not pretty. She is not famous except to men with wet cuffs. She is the last 100 yards of a global argument, and she speaks the last word with a steel smile and a wooden heart. August 15, 1945, Buckner Bay, Okinawa. The morning radio coughs and steadies. A voice rides over static, measured, ceremonial, broken only by the hiss of a sea that has forgotten how to be quiet. On the signal bridge of an attack transport, sailors lift their heads as if the ship itself had called their names. In the well of an LCVP idling off a pontoon causeway, coxswain Eddie Salazar hears the rumor before he hears the words. The war is ending. He leans on the combing, eyes narrowed, listening to the interpreter catch Emperor Hirohito's cadence and turn it into English, each phrase landing on the water like a flat stone that does not sink. Along the shoreline, the beach party pauses in the middle of a gesture, a bullhorn raised, a finger pointing, and then lets the finger drop. A boat crewman pulls his glove off with his teeth and rubs the heel of his hand across his face, leaving a smear of grease-like war paint he forgot to wash. The surf keeps its old appointment with the sand. The little boats keep breathing. Then, as if embarrassed by stillness, the radio net wakes to life again. Orders to stand fast, stand by, keep the lanes clear. Salazar exhales. He is not sure what he expected the end to sound like. He gives the Gray Marine a little throttle and feels his boat say, in its old language, ready. August 16th. Karama Redo. The anchorage turns domestic. Ships dress themselves with laundry. Whistles blow for reasons that are not fear. LCVPs ferry chaplains and shore patrolmen and crates of paperwork now that paperwork matters again. The boats also carry something else. Laughter that does not apologize. A bosun on a repair ship ties a bowline for a boy who should have learned it last year and never did. A Marine with a bandaged forearm takes a ride to an LST to find a dentist with a quiet hand. Salazar drops his ramp so a man with a Red Cross brassard can step aboard, then raises it with a winch that squeals like a kettle and settles like routine. August 20th, 1945. New Orleans, City Park Plant. The whistle blows at 700 and the morning shift walks in through doors that smell like varnish and sawdust and coffee. A foreman taps a chalk line on a half-framed hull and feels the tap echo up his arm. In the front office, a clerk opens a telegram from Washington and reads it twice. Contracts will taper, orders will cancel, the room feels too large. On the floor, a woman with a rivet gun sets her mask aside and listens to a rumor roll down the aisles. The war's over. Someone laughs and then covers her mouth. Someone else. A black welder who taught a white apprentice to read a bead 2 years ago flips his hood up and meets his friend's eyes. They nod, both relieved and uncertain. Andrew Higgins walks the aisle with his hat crushed in one hand, tie loose, impatience retooled into something that looks like pride and grief argued to a draw. We'll finish what's on the jigs, he says, and the phrase is an order and a benediction. August 27th, Tokyo Bay. Gray water, gray sky, gray hulls riding placid as courthouse steps. The battleship Missouri anchors like a city block with stacks. Around her, small boats flicker, LCVPs and barges and gigs, tiny sentences ringed around a fat period. Coxswain Walter McKee, Stripes, still new, eyes the battleship's tumble home and slides his landing craft alongside a gangway net laid down for men who do not plan to get wet today. A staff officer with a folder tied in tape steps into the well, followed by a signalman who keeps one hand on his cap as if decorum were a life preserver. On the Missouri's quarterdeck, men polish brass that already shines. An LCVP noses by loaded with photographers whose cases bang against the combing like accordions. McKee holds station on the battleship's wake and thinks absurdly of Cleveland streetcars stopping at their marks with the same polite finality. September 2nd, Tokyo Bay, Surrender Day. Morning hangs bright, almost insolent. The quarterdeck is crowded with hats and shoulders and the click of cameras writing their own Bible. From the water, the scene looks theatrical in a sincere way. Flags that saw the last months in caves and holds finally out where a wind can find them. Pens uncapped over a leather folder. The little boats idle in an oval, motors muttering, men shading their eyes with palms. McKee ferries an Australian correspondent whose jacket doesn't match his trousers, and a Chinese officer whose shoes shine like hard candy. He raises his voice only once, to the winchman, to the cable, because on a day like this, even steel should mind its manners. When the signatures are dry, a signal flows down the ships like a blessing. Sirens low and human, horns that sound like jokes a city tells itself at noon. The boats answer with wakes that overlap and then separate, pedals on gray water. A sailor with his cap at a foolish angle stands in an LCVP's bow and cries without hiding it. The coxswain looks away and pretends he needs to check a line. September 5th, Manila Harbor. Repatriation mornings are busy and tender. The LCVPs shuttle to troop transports where railings are crowded with faces still thin. A line of POWs files down into a boat with the quiet of men who used all their noise months ago. A medic's hand hovers near each elbow as if touch itself might shatter something. The boat's ramp becomes a kind of threshold, out of a chapter no one will read to their children, into the clatter of mess kits and the rude generosity of a Navy cook who ladles too much on purpose. Salazar plants as gently as he can. He has learned that a man who spent 3 years in a cage sometimes hesitates at the last step and needs the water to be a mirror, not a mouth. September 7th, Yokosuka Naval Base. Occupation is a cadence, not a moment. LCVPs ferry Marine MPs who tap batons against their thighs like metronomes. They haul stevedores and rolls of wire and a piano that rides lashed to the deck, its keys wrapped in oilcloth. They carry a civil engineer who studies a bombed-out dry dock and says, "We can make this breathe again," like a promise to a stranger. The little boats, so long devout in their verbs, carry, plant, back, add new words, return, retrieve, repatriate. When the tide sets awkwardly against the quay wall, the coxswain lets the current deliver the bow, not daring the engine to make an honest mistake. September 10th, New Orleans, Michoud. Higgins Industries devours its last wartime lumber. The long jigs stand like empty pews. A teenage riveter carries his mask to a locker and stares at the stamp on its forehead as if it were a name he must learn to spell differently now. A supervisor posts a list on a board. Layoffs coming, severance the law requires, references if asked. It reads like a casualty sheet in reverse. Men and women released to live. Andrew Higgins stands in an office where maps are receding into irrelevance and runs a thumb down a ledger of names he hired on the only rule that ever mattered to him. Can you do the job? He thinks of a plant full of accents and recipes and songs that got along because the work made them neighbors. He thinks of a spoon bow on Lake Pontchartrain sliding over 10 inches of water like a miracle anyone could measure with a stick. When the shift horn blows for lunch, the floor empties into a yard where summer has not yet decided to end. A woman unknots her kerchief and shakes the sweat out of her hair. A man lights a cigarette and then remembers he said he'd quit when the war did. They stand under a sky that seems too large for a city that suddenly does not need so many boats. Someone tells a story about the day a foreman stopped a line because a hinge on a ramp threw one bright spark too many. Someone else says, "What are we going to build now?" The answers will scatter: oil field equipment, kitchen cabinets, boats modified for shrimp and river work, but the sound in their voices is the same. We remember how to make things true. September 12th, Tokyo Bay, small boat pool. A line of LCVPs sits abreast, bows squared to the wind, paint chalked with salt. A petty officer strolls the planks with a clipboard and a pencil behind his ear, calling out hull numbers that have become nicknames. He stops at one with a pelican painted small on her ramp hinge and smiles without telling anyone why. McKee sands a nick on a combing and blows the dust off with a puff that tastes of pine and ocean. "You keeping her?" the petty officer asks, half joking. McKee shrugs. "She kept me," he says. The petty officer writes something, nothing official, some human notation, and moves on. September 20th, along the Mississippi, south of Algiers Point. A civilian tug pushes a string of barges. The river glides thick and brown under a late summer sun. Tied up at a ramshackle yard, an LCVP wears a fresh coat of ordinary paint and a new name stenciled where numbers used to be. A shrimper steps onto a ramp with a coil of line over one shoulder and a coffee thermos under the other. The boat feels bigger without the war around it. The shrimper taps the hinge with his boot as he passes, a gesture he does not know he shares with men whose hands still smell of cordite. He noses the boat away from the dock and into the current, testing throttle and rudder, learning again that flat bottoms and tunneled props speak the same language in peace that they spoke under fire. The LCVP's silhouette will haunt coasts for years, on rivers in Indochina where French tricolors flicker in humidity, on bays where state fish and game wardens admire a ramp that turns mangrove into a gentle, workable edge, on construction sites where a bridge must be built from both banks toward a middle that only exists on paper. Some boats will rot in the weeds and gift their frames back to the earth. Some will be cut down and turned into workaday skiffs with a lineage they wear like a secret. At Buckner Bay, a typhoon will come in October and roll ships over like toys, and boats that lived the war will die in peacetime's careless hand. In New Orleans, men will still argue about prop tunnels and chine angles over coffee thick as a sermon, because arguing is how you say you care in a city that owes its pulse to water. Andrew Higgins, chest out, tie crooked, mouth quick, will keep hiring and firing and dreaming contraptions into factories and will not slow until his heart does years later with a scrap of profanity and a grin still handy. On the deck of a transport headed east, Salazar sits with his back to the ramp and a hand on the winch drum, feeling for flats on the cable with his fingertips. Weems, bored and grateful, uses a pocket knife to dig sand out of the tread of a boot. He promises he'll throw away and never will. McKee rigs a tarp against a drizzle and writes a letter he expects finally to mail. Boudreaux, somewhere between the present and a bayou, sleeps with his mouth open and dreams of a spoon bow sliding over 10 inches of water while a man with a loose tie says, "Drop the damned ramp," and the water says, "All right." The war's last 100 yards have become the first yards of something else. The little boat, which was never pretty, only perfect, keeps its habits even as the verbs change. When the coxswain reaches out, sleepy and automatic, and taps the ramp hinge with 2 knuckles, he is not superstition's prisoner. He is saluting a truth, that a door, once invented, keeps showing you edges and insisting they are entrances if you have the nerve. October 8th, 1945, Industrial Canal, New Orleans. A surplus LCVP in dull civilian gray rocks gently against a piling while a crane lowers pallets of rope and a coil of shrimp net aboard. The gray marine 225 coughs, catches and smooths into that familiar chest-deep hum. A shrimper named Thibodeau, cap stained with salt, hands nicked in the same place as a coxswain's would be, steps onto the steel ramp as if onto the porch of a house. He taps the hinge with the heel of his boot without knowing why, then grins at the way the boat backs out of the slip like an old friend who remembers every shallow on the way home. The industrial canal smells of diesel and hot pine. On the far side, the city park plant doors stand open to air where jigs used to hold hulls as straight as intention. November 20th, 1945, City Park Plant. Whistles still cut the day into thirds, but the rush is gone. Frames on the line look like sentences that end in ellipses. Women remove their kerchiefs at lunch and smooth their hair. Black welders and white riveters pass a cigarette back and forth and say nothing about what comes next because there are no more numbers to chase. Only the silence after a metronome stops. Andrew Jackson Higgins walks the floor with his hat crushed in his fist, tie loose. He runs a palm along a fresh ramp, not to inspect it, but to remember the texture of necessity. "Finish what's on the jigs," he says, and the foremen nod because that order is both practical and merciful. Out in the yard, a flatbed waits to carry a boat to a parish that never thought it would own war wood. April 9th, 1947. Saigon River, French Indochina. The river runs the color of tea under a sky that sweats before the men do. A French coxswain in a borrowed American helmet squints over the squared bow of an LCVP that now wears a tricolor on its combing. In the well, colonial troops crouch with carbines wrapped in oilcloth. Mangroves lean in, their roots like knotted fists. The coxswain feathers throttle and lets the tunneled prop idle the boat sideways into a muddy notch where no bow should fit. Ramp! The steel door drops and becomes, in this new world, a polite suggestion to a hostile bank. Make room, the boat backs out, leaving the water puzzled and closing, the way it always has. The design does not know the language of the flags on its gunnels. It only knows edges and how to turn them into doors. June 3rd, 1948, New Orleans, hiring office. A young man in a clean shirt, his veteran's pin, the only decoration, asks if the plan is taking on. The clerk, hair pinned tight, pencil tucked behind her ear, looks at the board and shakes her head, then leans in to whisper a list of other yards, oil field outfits, the ship repair shops at Algiers, a cousin who needs a carpenter. Outside, the heat turns a streetcar rail into a line of light. Across town on a porch, an old foreman taps a hinge with a hammer and listens for the note out of habit, then laughs at himself and pours 2 fingers of something brown into a jelly glass. The war gave him a reflex he cannot shake and a pride he will not apologize for. May 11th, 1950. Barataria Bay. Thibodeau noses his LCVP toward a lacework of marsh where white herons step with arguments in their heads. The ramp drops to make a temporary dock over soft mud. 2 men slide sacks of oyster shell onto the bow and make a road a crabber can use. A state warden leans on the combing, admires the way the flat run rides inches of water, and decides he needs one of these funny little boxes for his own work. At idle, the boat still wears the sound of every beach she ever kissed. Hagushi, Easy Red, Port Winston, a low patient vibration you feel in your molars. June 6, 1950. Omaha Beach. The wind comes off the channel cold and clean. A handful of veterans, hair-trimmed conservative short or already thinning, stand with hands in pockets and eyes on the surf. A French fisherman in rubber boots points to a line of darker water that means a bar and says, "I see," because he knows what a boat must do there. A preserved LCVP, museum fresh paint trying to hide an old soul, drops her ramp in ceremony and lets children walk down it onto sand that will never again be naive. One of the men reaches out and touches the cable with 2 fingertips as if testing a pulse. "Always the same sound," he says, and the others nod, though they can't hear it over the tide. September 14th, 1951. Industrial Canal, office upstairs. Higgins dictates a letter with more sand than sugar in it, arguing a price for a peacetime contract like the war were merely a different salesman he'd already beaten. He barks at a visitor for saying can't, then laughs at his own temper and offers coffee strong enough to varnish a hull. On the wall hangs a photograph, Lake Pontchartrain, a spoonboat sliding onto a strip of sand with a mule watching, Quantico men in coats and skepticism. Some afternoons he walks to the rail above the floor, listens for the old line rhythm, and hears only the solitary clank of a hammer and the mosquito hum of peacetime work. He looks old only when the light isn't doing him any favors. August 1st, 1952, New Orleans. The telephone calls roll outward with the clumsy kindness of bad news. Foremen remove caps, women fold hands, welders let their hoods hang down their backs like unstrung bells. Andrew Jackson Higgins is gone, heart surrendered after a life that was all engine. That afternoon, the city park floor is still for 1 minute. Even the dust hangs and waits. In kitchens across the city, men and women who learn to read oak and fir and steel the way other people read scripture sit quiet and touch the tables their pay bought. On the river, tugs push barges. On the lake, a breeze from the east ruffles the chop into the same pattern Higgins took as a lesson. Wind over shallow water, telling you exactly what kind of bow your boat should wear. September 7th, 1952. Canal Street, New Orleans, procession. Mourners in Sunday suits sweat through the heat and keep their pace because it feels like a contract. Someone from the old personnel office, gray at the temples now, remembers the day the boss said, "Hire anybody who can swing a hammer." Someone else remembers being hired because of that sentence. A black welder and a white carpenter shoulder together at the curb and decide, without speaking, to follow the hearse 2 blocks just to see him turn the corner one last time. In 1,000 kitchens, the same words are said with different accents. He cursed like a tugboat. He paid Friday. He hired my sister. He told us to break the damned hinge and build it better. He made a boat that knew the difference between an edge and an entrance. November 11th, 1952. A boat shop beside a bayou. Thibodeau sands the scar the ramp winch left on the coaming and blows sawdust into light. The particles hang like minnows. The radio mutters a waltz. His boy, long-legged and curious, asks why the ramp cable sings when it's raised. Because it remembers, the father says, surprising himself with the poetry of truth. He shows the boy how to grease a sheave, how to listen to a hinge, how to read the tide line, how to plant soft. When they idle out into water the color of old brass, the boat steps across 10 inches as if it were stepping over a story it knows by heart. There will be other chapters, boats cut down into work skiffs, hulls left in weeds to gift their ribs back to the earth, a dozen museums polishing one like it were a chalice. A general will be quoted for the rest of his life as saying that 4 things won the war: the Jeep, the Liberty ship, the C-47, and the Higgins boat. And every man who ever leaned into a tiller and felt a flat-bottom hull answer in a cross set will nod and add quietly, "and the people who built them." In notebooks, planners draw lines and write throughput, but in memory, coxswains and riflemen remember the last 100 yards as a voice. 2 minutes, plant, ramp. The grammar of a door invented in a city that lives on the edge between brown water and salt. Years from this moment, a veteran will stand in a museum well, run his palm along a coaming, and tap the aft hinge twice with 2 knuckles, almost embarrassed at the superstition, and then smile when he hears the faintest answer, a cable's small sigh, or his own blood naming what it loved. You could say the boat was never beautiful. You could also say that in the exact way the word matters, it was perfect.